I had always thought of my property as my sanctuary. Nestled just outside the suburban sprawl, it was a patch of earth that had been in my family for generations, untouched and quiet. The land wasn't just soil and trees. It was the memories of my grandfather walking through the oak groves, my mother tending a small garden, the echoes of laughter that only returned when the wind passed just right. It was a place that grounded me, even as the world outside seemed increasingly chaotic. I never imagined that one day, this sacred space would be thrust into the center of a battle with the most ruthless bureaucracy I had ever faced, the Homeowners Association. It began with subtle signs, little shifts in the neighborhood that I barely noticed at first. The roads near my property, which had once ended in a quiet cul-de-sac, started seeing an unusual increase in traffic. Trucks and construction vehicles began appearing, seemingly out of nowhere, leaving deep tire tracks in the dirt along the old paths. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. Perhaps another developer had purchased adjacent land, or maybe it was just seasonal construction. I kept to myself, tending my property, trusting that the legal boundaries were solid. But then, one morning, I drove down the lane that led to my house and froze. There, on what I had always considered my front field, were stakes marking our plots. Bright orange flags fluttered mockingly in the breeze. Bulldozers were lined up like a parade of steel beasts, ready to tear apart the quiet that had defined this land for decades. And at the center of the chaos stood a man in a hard hat, clipboard in hand, barking orders to a crew that moved with military precision. It took me days to process what I was seeing. The HOA had put plans in motion. 9 to 6 homes. 9 to 6 homes, directly on my property, without my consent, without any prior warning. The paperwork, I learned later, had been filed months ago under a corporate name that no one I had spoken to in the neighborhood recognized. Somehow, I had slipped through their net. Somehow, in the vast bureaucracy of permits, surveys, and zoning applications, my ownership had been ignored, or so they thought. The first instinct was anger, of course. Raw, burning anger that seemed to pulse through my veins every time I walked past a construction site. I considered calling the police, local authorities, anyone who could stop this madness. But as I dug deeper, a cold, horrifying realization set in. Legally, I had no immediate recourse. The HOA had their permits in order, or so they claimed. They had the signatures, the forms, the surveys, all the technicalities that made their actions seem legitimate to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. In the evenings, I sat on the edge of my property, staring at the half-cleared fields, wondering how they could be so bold. How could they just march onto someone's land, with bulldozers and crews, and assume that ownership was irrelevant? It felt personal, almost like a violation. Every tree that fell, every inch of earth turned over by heavy machinery, felt like a betrayal. This wasn't just construction, it was an invasion. I began documenting everything. Photographs of the stakes, the machines, the trucks with logos plastered across their doors. Notes on the exact dates and times of construction activity. Anything that could later serve as proof that my property was being encroached upon. I had to be meticulous. The HOA was methodical. They ran on systems of rules and regulations that seemed designed to overwhelm anyone who dared challenge them. But I knew that if I could outthink them, if I could be patient and strategic, there might be a way to turn this nightmare to my advantage. And that's when the idea took root. Let them finish. It was almost perverse, the logic of it. Instead of rushing to stop them, I would let the HOA complete the construction of all 9 to 6 homes. Each house, each paved driveway, each street lamp, every little detail would stand as a testament to their overreach. And when they were done, when the community believed the land was theirs, that's when I would make my move. I began researching, tirelessly, obsessively, about the nuances of property law. Every loophole, every clause, every obscure right that a landowner might hold even against a powerful HOA. I discovered that the act of letting the land be developed didn't necessarily constitute forfeiture of ownership. There were cases, rare and often messy, where landowners had reclaimed property even after significant construction. The key, I realized, was timing, precision, and a meticulous legal strategy. During the months that followed, life became a careful dance. Each morning, I would walk the perimeter of my property, observing the workers, noting every detail. They were so confident, so assured that the land belonged to them, that they never once questioned my presence. I became a ghost in my own sanctuary, watching the intrusion, cataloging every development. Neighbors began whispering. Some came to me, curious or concerned. Others avoided eye contact, afraid to align with someone tangling with the HOA. Their reactions were predictable. People tend to side with the apparent victor, even before a battle is fought. But a few neighbors quietly offered tips. Small inconsistencies in the permits, anomalies in the survey lines, odd clauses in the HOA agreements. Piece by piece, I began assembling a puzzle that seemed impossible at first glance. As the first homes began to rise, I felt a strange mixture of dread and anticipation. Watching them build my land, brick by brick, was almost unbearable. Yet, there was a thrill in the knowledge that this construction, this apparent triumph of bureaucracy over ownership, was temporary. Every nail driven into the foundation, every roof installed, every street carved into my land would eventually serve as evidence of audacity and, ultimately, my victory. I took mental notes of each home's progress, the exact dimensions, the placement on the land, the style, even the colors. Later, this information would prove essential. The more I documented, the more I realized that the HOA's mistake wasn't in construction. It was in assuming that paperwork and momentum equaled legitimacy. They had overlooked the one thing that could never be duplicated or forged: my deed, my ancestral claim, my rightful ownership. Months turned into a year, and the land transformed into a suburban microcosm. Streets, sidewalks, parks, and homes that should never have existed on my property now sprawled across the horizon. From a distance, the scene looked like triumph for the HOA, a completed development ready to be sold or rented. But I walked through it like a silent judge, marking every detail, every irregularity, every assumption they had made that could later be challenged. At night, I imagined a moment of confrontation. The courtroom, the stunned faces of HOA executives and lawyers, the realization that everything they had built, everything they thought they had claimed, rested precariously on assumptions rather than rights. I could almost feel the weight of the deed in my hands, the finality of justice about to be served. It became an obsession, a singular focus. They had overstepped, and I would make them pay in the most thorough, meticulous way possible. By the end of that first year, the HOA community was nearly complete. The homes stood tall and ready for occupancy. Streets were paved, streetlights installed, and landscaping added to make the development appear polished and legitimate. From the outside, it was a picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, a testament to careful planning and organized effort. From my perspective, it was a ticking time bomb, a stage perfectly set for the unraveling of hubris. And just as I had predicted, the confidence of the HOA was absolute. They walked the streets I had once called my own, oblivious to the truth, blind to the legal storm that was gathering just beyond their perception. The arrogance of certainty is a dangerous thing. I had learned that lesson early, watching bureaucracies operate with blind faith in their own authority. As I stood at the edge of my land, looking over what appeared to be their victory, I realized something crucial. Patience was more powerful than confrontation. There had been moments, early on, when I wanted to storm the construction site, to scream, to force them off. But I restrained myself. Letting them complete the work was strategic. The more they invested in the land, the more confident they became, and the more devastating the reversal would be when I finally acted. And now, as the last touches were being applied, I began preparing for the next stage, the court case. The months of observation, documentation, and legal preparation would soon pay off. The HOA had built an empire on assumptions, on momentum, on the belief that bureaucracy could override ownership. But I had something stronger than momentum, stronger than bureaucracy. I had the law on my side, and I had patience. The quiet satisfaction of anticipation settled over me like a cloak. Soon, the scene of my supposed defeat would become the arena of my triumph. The homes they had erected would stand as monuments, not to their power, but to their overconfidence. And I would reclaim my land, not through confrontation, not through shouting, but through precision, strategy, and an unwavering faith in my rights. As I walked back toward my old farmhouse, the horizon dotted with rooftops that were never meant to be there, I felt a mixture of dread and exhilaration. The first chapter of this ordeal was ending, but the battle had only just begun. They thought they had conquered me. They had no idea what was coming. When the last rooftop gleamed under the sun and the final streetlight flickered to life, a strange silence settled over my property. It was a kind of quiet that comes before a storm, an almost tangible pause in the rhythm of daily life. For the HOA, the mission was complete. They had transformed my land into a suburban vision of perfection. 9 to 6 homes, each with manicured lawns, freshly paved driveways, and even the little parks that had been part of their blueprint for months. To any casual observer, it was a bustling new community, ready to welcome residents and show off its model homes. But to me, it was a stage perfectly set for the drama that was about to unfold. In the days following the completion, I allowed myself a brief period of observation. I walked along the streets they had carved, taking note of every detail, memorizing the placement of homes, the alignment of sidewalks, the location of community amenities. It was surreal to see my land reshaped so drastically, yet I felt no panic. There was a strained beauty in their craftsmanship, the way the sunlight hit the rooftops, the symmetry of the lawns, even the chirping of birds that had returned to the new trees planted along the sidewalks. Every detail was a silent testament to the audacity of their assumption, and every detail was something I would use to my advantage. Neighbors began to notice my presence more frequently. Some would cross the street when they saw me walking by, their curiosity tempered by fear. Others whispered behind fences, exchanging glances as if I was some kind of looming figure in the shadows. Rumors started to circulate. "He's going to do something," they said. "He's going to challenge the HOA." Their speculation amused me. Let them wonder. The more they underestimated my patience and strategy, the better. I began the meticulous process of assembling my legal case. This wasn't going to be a battle of anger or confrontation. It would be a war of evidence, precision, and strategy. Every photograph I had taken during construction, every note on machinery movements, every discrepancy in the HOA paperwork became a weapon. I reviewed surveys, deeds, and property maps, cross-referencing them against the HOA's filings. There were anomalies, small but critical errors that revealed their oversight, a misfiled boundary, a surveying error on one corner of the property, a vague clause in the community's bylaws that they had exploited without understanding its limits. As the preparation continued, I reached out to experts, surveyors, property attorneys, and even retired HOA officials who had witnessed similar disputes were brought into the fold. Each conversation, each review, reinforced the same conclusion. The HOA had built 96 homes on land that wasn't theirs, and the moment of reckoning was imminent. The legal pathways were clear, but the timing had to be perfect. Acting too soon could alert them. Acting too late might complicate proceedings. Precision was everything. Meanwhile, the HOA carried on as if nothing were amiss. Meetings were held in the community center they had constructed on my land. Executives paraded through the streets for promotional photographs, and brochures advertising the neighborhood were distributed to prospective buyers. They were confident, arrogantly so, in the permanence of their actions. But confidence, as I had learned, is often the precursor to downfall. I continued my daily walks, observing the little signs that revealed their assumptions. There were inconsistencies in lot numbers, mismatched fencing, and occasional deviation from building codes that were subtle but noteworthy. These were small cracks in the armor of their narrative, and I catalogued each one with meticulous care. It was during these walks that I realized the psychological advantage I held. They believed the land was theirs. I knew it never had been. And that knowledge carried with it a quiet power that no permit or filing could override. At night, I would sit in the farmhouse, poring over documents by the light of a single lamp, the silence of the property broken only by the occasional distant sound of a lawnmower or the hum of a security light. The contrast between the bustling HOA activity and my solitary preparation was striking. I wasn't merely planning a legal claim. I was crafting a narrative that would expose their hubris and reclaim what had always been mine. Every page of research, every legal precedent, every photograph became a building block in the architecture of my strategy. It wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was about making a statement, about showing that even the most powerful bureaucracies could be held accountable when they overstepped. I thought about the history of my family and the generations who had lived on this land, about the oak groves and gardens that had been a sanctuary for decades. The HOA had treated my property as if it were an empty canvas, a place to expand their empire without consequence. I intended to remind them, in the most undeniable way, that ownership is not just a piece of paper. It is a right, and it is sacred. As weeks turned into months, the HOA began to sense that something was amiss. The first signs were subtle, a casual glance that lingered too long in my direction, a conversation cut short when I appeared, the occasional security patrol that seemed less about protection and more about intimidation. I watched from my vantage points as their confidence wavered ever so slightly. They couldn't see what I was doing, but they could feel that the wind was shifting. During this period, I also began reaching out to legal contacts who specialize in property disputes of this magnitude. Case studies, historical rulings, and obscure statutes became my guides. One particular precedent caught my attention, a case in which an HOA had assumed control over land through construction and occupancy, only to lose in court because the original owner had meticulously documented ownership and timing. That case became my blueprint. I needed to ensure that every aspect of my claim was indisputable, that every moment of construction was accounted for, and that the court could see the extent of the HOA's overreach. Despite the meticulous planning, there were moments of doubt. Watching the home stand, knowing the HOA had invested thousands of man-hours and dollars into construction, was daunting. Could I really reclaim everything? Would the court side with me? The uncertainty was almost paralyzing at times. But each time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the facts. The land was mine. legally and historically, and no amount of construction could alter that truth. Finally, the day came to take the first formal step. With a thick folder of documents, photographs, surveys, and expert opinions, I filed my claim in the local court. The filing was precise, methodical, and devastatingly thorough. It didn't demand immediate action against the HOA. It simply established a record, making it clear that ownership had been challenged and that any assumptions they had made would no longer hold legal weight. News of the filing spread through the community quietly at first, and then like wildfire. The HOA board convened emergency meetings, their lawyers scrambling to assess the situation. Panic replaced confidence, and for the first time, I sensed genuine fear. They realized, perhaps too late, that they had built on the wrong foundation, both literally and figuratively. Every house they had completed, every street they had paved, was now evidence in a case that could strip them of everything. I continued my silent vigil, walking the streets they had constructed, photographing details, and noting each deviation, however minor. The irony was almost delicious. They had worked tirelessly to create a perfect community on land that wasn't theirs, while I watched, patient and unshaken, ready to deliver the final blow. The power dynamic had shifted. The HOA, which had assumed authority over my property with confidence and arrogance, was now reacting defensively, unsure of how to proceed. The legal battle had officially begun, but the true confrontation would not occur in the streets, or in angry arguments, or in threats. It would occur in the quiet, calculated environment of the courtroom, where documentation, strategy, and patience outweighed brute force. And I was ready. I had spent months preparing for this moment, studying every angle, anticipating every countermove, and ensuring that when the time came, my claim would be indisputable. As night fell, casting long shadows over the rooftops that had never belonged to the HOA, I felt a sense of quiet triumph. The land was no longer just a place. It was a weapon, a testament to patience, strategy, and the certainty of rightful ownership. The stage was set. The players were in place. And when the court proceedings began, the HOA would finally learn the cost of assuming what was never theirs. The courthouse loomed over the city like a silent sentinel, a building of stone and glass that held the power to decide the fate of 96 homes built on a land that was never theirs. I walked through its halls with quiet confidence, carrying folders heavy with evidence, photographs, and legal research. Each step echoed in the empty corridors, a rhythmic reminder of the long months I had spent preparing for this day. It wasn't theatrics that would win this battle. It was documentation, precision, and patience. The HOA had assumed victory the moment they had broken ground. I was about to show them just how dangerous arrogance could be. The courtroom was already buzzing with activity when I arrived. Lawyers for the HOA moved between tables, their expressions a mixture of confidence and mild unease. I noticed their subtle glances at me, the faint tension in their posture. They believed that the construction they had completed, their permits, and their assumed authority would make my claim irrelevant. They had not accounted for one simple truth. Owning land is more than a legal technicality. It is a right, and mine was indisputable. When the proceedings began, I watched closely as the HOA presented their narrative. Their lead attorney spoke with a practiced confidence, recounting the timeline of construction, the permits filed, and the approvals granted. Every word, every photograph, every diagram was meant to convey a sense of legitimacy, as though the act of building on my property somehow transferred ownership by default. Their confidence was palpable, but I noticed cracks, tiny inconsistencies in dates, discrepancies in signatures, minor surveying errors. Each detail was a thread I could pull to unravel the entire tapestry of their assumed authority. When my attorney presented our evidence, the courtroom seemed to shift in atmosphere. The first folder opened revealed photographs of my land taken long before construction began, showing the natural boundaries, the original flora, and markers that clearly indicated ownership. Next came the detailed surveys, meticulously cross-referenced against the HOA's own maps, highlighting misaligned property lines and incorrect filings. One by one, each document chipped away at their narrative, quietly but decisively. I watched as the HOA attorney fidgeted. Their composed demeanor began to falter as our presentation continued. Emails, timestamps, and official documents revealed that the HOA had been negligent in verifying the land's ownership before commencing construction. They had relied on assumptions, ignored warnings, and bypassed due diligence, all in the belief that momentum and bureaucracy was sufficient to claim legitimacy. It was a damning revelation, and the courtroom felt the weight of it. The evidence didn't just prove ownership. It painted a picture of overreach and hubris. I had anticipated that the shock value would play a critical role. As photographs of freshly built homes, roads, and community facilities flashed across the screen, the subtle implication was impossible to ignore. Every structure they had erected, every improvement made to my land had been done under false assumptions. The HOA had invested heavily in a property they had no legal right to touch, and the realization was beginning to dawn in real time. I could see it in their expressions, the sudden anxiety, the whispered conversations, the uneasy shuffling of papers. For the first time since construction began, the HOA understood that their victory was precarious. Months of confident action had been undone by meticulous preparation, attention to detail, and the unwavering assertion of legal rights. They were facing a force they could not intimidate, a truth they could not fabricate, and a claim they could not dispute without substantial evidence that simply did not exist in their favor. The court proceedings continued for days. Witnesses were called, surveys examined, and legal precedent cited. Every argument the HOA made was met with counter-arguments grounded in documented fact. I watched from the sidelines as their carefully constructed narrative collapsed, piece by piece. Their confidence eroded with each presentation, replaced by desperation and disbelief. The 9-6 homes that had once seemed untouchable now became the symbols of their overreach, standing as monuments to their misjudgment. One particularly critical moment occurred when a retired surveyor, brought in as an expert witness, confirmed the precise boundaries of my property. The HOA had relied on a flawed survey conducted by an overworked contractor, assuming that minor errors in measurement were insignificant. The witness laid out, in meticulous detail, how the errors had resulted in a complete encroachment on my land. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air like a tangible presence. The HOA's legal team exchanged panicked glances, realizing the depth of their mistake. It was then that the media, sensing the drama unfolding, began to take notice. Photographers and reporters, drawn by the story of a small property owner standing up to a powerful HOA, filled the galleries. The narrative was irresistible, a David versus Goliath scenario in which the overconfident bureaucracy had built an empire on stolen ground, only to face a meticulously documented legal challenge. The presence of cameras and journalists added a new layer of pressure on the HOA, their actions no longer confined to the courtroom but exposed to public scrutiny. Throughout the proceedings, as the case progressed, additional witnesses and documentation further reinforced my position. Neighbors who had observed the construction process provided testimony about the lack of notice, the unusual filings, and the HOA's assumption that the land was unclaimed. Emails between HOA executives revealed internal doubts that had never been disclosed publicly, exposing a level of negligence that was both shocking and undeniable. Each piece of evidence added weight to the narrative. The HOA had acted recklessly, and the legal foundation of their actions was fundamentally flawed. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Lawyers argued, judges examined documents with furrowed brows, and I continued my silent observation. It was strange to watch the structures I had once feared as symbols of intrusion transform into instruments of vindication. The very homes that had seemed to represent my loss were now visual proof of the HOA's overreach. Every street, every fence, every streetlight became evidence in a case that was rapidly turning in my favor. By the end of the week, it was clear that the tide had shifted. The HOA, which had entered the courtroom with confidence bordering on arrogance, now faced a reality they could not escape. The evidence was overwhelming. The photographs, surveys, witness statements, and expert testimony collectively painted a picture of reckless overreach and misplaced confidence. The 9-6 homes, once symbols of assumed ownership, had become the undeniable proof that their actions were unlawful. As the court recessed for the weekend, I walked past the rows of homes, each one a silent testament to the unfolding drama. The sun reflected off rooftops, casting long shadows over the streets, a visual metaphor for the contrast between perception and reality. What had seemed permanent and unassailable was now fragile, exposed to the scrutiny of law and truth. And I knew that when the proceedings resumed, the final chapters of this battle would unfold with dramatic clarity. The HOA's panic was no longer hidden. I had seen the subtle signs in their behavior, the whispered arguments behind closed doors, the sudden consultations with additional lawyers, the anxious glances toward the courtroom gallery. They were beginning to understand, perhaps too late, that the foundation of their confidence had been nothing more than assumption and bureaucratic momentum. And through it all, I remained calm. Every photograph, every survey, every piece of evidence had been gathered with this moment in mind. I had let them build, let them believe, let them invest. And now, the full impact of that strategy was unfolding in a public, undeniable, and irreversible way. The 9-6 homes were not just homes. They were proof. Proof that overconfidence can be fatal. Proof that diligence and patience are more powerful than arrogance. And proof that rightfully owned land cannot be stolen without consequence. The days following the initial courtroom revelations were unlike anything I had imagined. For the HOA, the atmosphere had shifted from confident control to unspoken dread. I could feel it even from my vantage point in the courtroom gallery, observing them like predators suddenly aware of the trap they had walked into. Their boardroom meetings had become frantic, their lawyers scouring every possible loophole, every obscure clause that might save the 9-6 homes from the consequences of their own recklessness. But there was no escaping the truth. They had built an empire on land that wasn't theirs, and the law was beginning to see it for what it was. The next phase of the proceedings was an intense cross-examination. I watched silently as their own surveyors were brought to the stand, forced to reconcile measurements that contradicted the HOA's claims. Each response from their experts exposed new cracks in their narrative. The boundaries they had assumed, the filings they had relied upon, even the permits they thought protected them, were suddenly inadequate under the scrutiny of precise evidence. Every misstep, every overlooked detail, every assumption became another weight against them, tilting the balance unmistakably in my favor. It was surreal to witness the transformation of the HOA's confidence into panic. Board members who had once spoken in firm, commanding tones now muttered nervously in the hallways. Lawyers who had walked in with air control now pored over legal tomes with anxious intensity, attempting to uncover any precedent that could salvage their position. Every glance in my direction was now tinged with fear, a recognition that the small landowner they had dismissed had orchestrated a strategy far beyond their understanding. I spent the days between sessions meticulously reviewing the progress. While the HOA scrambled, I continued documenting the homes, noting subtle details that reinforced the timeline of their overreach. Landscaping photos, construction dates, witness testimonies. Each piece fit perfectly into the legal framework I had constructed. The irony was not lost on me. The more the HOA invested in embellishing my land, the more ammunition I accumulated for the court. What had once felt like a violation had become a weapon, each house a testament to their hubris. One particularly dramatic moment came when an independent legal expert was brought in to review the HOA's documents. His assessment was blunt and devastating. The HOA had acted with negligent disregard for property law. The permits they relied upon, the surveys they had commissioned, even the chain of signatures they presented as authority, all were incomplete or inaccurate. In some cases, the filings contained errors so fundamental that they were deemed legally void. The courtroom murmured at the revelation, and I felt the quiet satisfaction of seeing months of preparation come to life. Meanwhile, news of the case began to leak outside the courtroom. Local reporters, captivated by the spectacle of a single landowner challenging a powerful HOA, began circulating stories online. Social media buzzed with speculation and commentary. Headline framed the drama with words like David versus Goliath and HOA overreach exposed. While the media attention added pressure to the HOA, it also reinforced the psychological dimension of the battle. Their every misstep was now public, a visible record of arrogance and negligence. Inside the courtroom, tension escalated to a level that almost seemed tangible. The HOA attorneys attempted to argue that construction and occupancy implied consent, that my delay in taking action somehow diminished my claim. But I had anticipated this argument. Every legal precedent, every historical case, every clause in property law that supported the notion of absolute ownership had been cited. The judge, methodical and thorough, appeared increasingly skeptical of the HOA's assertions. Each carefully documented rebuttal chipped away at their narrative, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Witnesses who had observed construction firsthand provided critical testimony. Neighbors recalled unusual activity, unannounced surveys, and irregular communication from the HOA. Construction workers described being instructed to proceed as if the land were cleared and approved, despite irregularities they noticed on site. Each testimony reinforced a single point. The HOA had assumed authority they did not possess, and their actions were not just negligent, they were reckless. Perhaps the most dramatic moment of the week came when my attorney presented evidence of a critical misfiled document, a deed that proved, without question, my ownership of the property. The courtroom gasped as the judge examined the document. The legal implications were immediate and severe. Everything the HOA had built, everything they had claimed as theirs, rested on a false assumption, and the revelation of the deed shifted the balance irreversibly. The HOA's panic became almost cinematic. I observed board members whispering in heated discussions, lawyers flipping through binders, desperate for any salvageable argument. Every counterpoint they offered was met with irrefutable evidence. Every appeal to permits or procedural technicalities was neutralized by the clear, documented history of ownership. The courtroom became a stage where arrogance and preparation collided, and for the first time, the HOA realized that they were losing catastrophically. Outside the courtroom, the community buzzed. Prospective homeowners who had considered moving into the neighborhood were now hesitant. Rumors of legal uncertainty spread like wildfire. The HOA's reputation, carefully cultivated over years, began to unravel under the scrutiny of public attention. The very homes they had built as symbols of achievement were now liabilities, standing as evidence of overreach and recklessness. Despite the mounting tension, I remained calm. My strategy was unfolding exactly as I had envisioned. Patience had been the key. Letting them complete construction had created a perfect scenario for evidence and psychological leverage. Each home, street, and fixture became part of the narrative that would ultimately ensure my victory. The HOA had acted without consideration, and their assumption that momentum equaled legitimacy was their undoing. By the end of the week, the atmosphere in the courtroom was electric. Lawyers, judges, and witnesses alike sensed that the case was moving toward a dramatic conclusion. The HOA, once confident and assertive, now navigated the proceedings with caution, aware that any misstep could be fatal. Their panic was palpable. Their authority eroded, their strategy collapsing under the weight of evidence and meticulous preparation. As I left the courthouse that evening, the rows of 96 homes reflected in the distance like silent sentinels of the battle unfolding. What had once been a violation, a source of anxiety and frustration, was now the centerpiece of a calculated legal triumph. Each roof, each street, each meticulously landscaped lawn was a reminder of what overconfidence can cost, and what patience, preparation, and strategy can achieve. The HOA's empire, built on assumptions and bureaucracy, was crumbling. The next steps would be decisive. The stage was set for the final confrontation, where the deed, the documentation, and the law would converge to deliver the outcome I had long anticipated. And when that moment came, the full impact of their overreach would be realized in a way that would echo through the neighborhood and beyond, for years to come. The day of the final hearing arrived with an almost cinematic intensity. The courtroom was filled with an unusual tension, lawyers pacing, board members whispering in hushed tones, reporters clicking cameras in anticipation. For months, the HOA had projected confidence, but now, every gesture, every glance betrayed their anxiety. The 96 homes they had built on my land loomed silently in the background, proof of their audacity and, soon, their undoing. From the very start, the tone of the proceedings set the stage for the collapse of their authority. The judge, methodical and commanding, laid out the focus, ownership of the property, validity of the construction, and the implications of the HOA's actions on both legal and financial grounds. The atmosphere was electric. Every participant understood that this was no ordinary property dispute. This was a reckoning. When the first piece of evidence was presented, the courtroom collectively gasped. My attorney, with precision and clarity, walked the judge through the complete chain of ownership. The original deed, meticulously documented and verified, established my legal right to the land without question. Every signature, every recorded transaction, every historical record aligned perfectly. There was no room for dispute, no loophole the HOA could exploit. The impact was immediate. The HOA board members' faces drained of color, their confident facades crumbling in real time. The presentation of evidence continued, and it was as devastating as it was thorough. Photographs of the land before construction, aerial surveys, and expert testimonies were laid out sequentially, showing how every aspect of the 96 homes had been built on property that was rightfully mine. Witnesses described the systematic failure of the HOA to verify ownership, revealing negligence and assumption on an unprecedented scale. Every word reinforced a single, undeniable truth. The HOA had acted recklessly, arrogantly, and unlawfully. Perhaps the most shocking moment came when my attorney presented documentation showing internal communications among HOA executives. Emails, memos, and meeting notes revealed that some officials had privately questioned the legality of the construction long before it began, but had chosen to ignore their doubts in favor of speed and profit. The courtroom was stunned into silence. The arrogance of assumption, paired with documented internal awareness, left the HOA with no moral or legal defense. They had knowingly acted on land that was not theirs, and the evidence was irrefutable. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Board members shifted uneasily in their seats. Lawyers whispered furiously, flipping through binders in search of any mitigating evidence. But there was none. The structures they had built, the homes, the roads, the parks, stood as monumental evidence of their overreach. What had been intended as a demonstration of their control had become a trap, a meticulously documented exhibition of miscalculation. I watched silently as the momentum of the case carried us toward the climactic moment. Every point my legal team made was met with judicial scrutiny that favored precision and historical fact over conjecture. The more evidence we presented, the more the HOA faltered. They were facing a perfect storm. The law, the documentation, and the visual reality of their overreach all converged to leave them exposed. Then came the final presentation, a comparative survey showing the construction layout overlaid on my verified property boundaries. Each home, street, and fixture was clearly mapped against the true ownership lines. It was undeniable. Every inch of construction was encroachment. Every dollar invested in development was on property that did not belong to them. The courtroom absorbed the weight of this revelation. For the first time, it was not just legal argument. It was visual proof, a picture of overreach that could not be ignored. The HOA's desperation became palpable. Their lead attorney attempted to argue good faith reliance on permits and previous filings. But the judge, unwavering, questioned each assertion with pointed precision. The emails and internal notes previously presented contradicted every claim of innocence. Every attempt at justification crumbled under the weight of clear ownership and meticulously documented evidence. Confidence had turned to panic, and panic was all that remained. I observed a silent realization wash over the board members. The homes they had built, the infrastructure they had installed, even the landscape parks, were no longer assets. They were liabilities. They had invested in a claim that was fundamentally flawed. Every structure stood as irrefutable proof that they had assumed control without authority. The financial implications alone were staggering, but the legal consequences were far more severe. As the judge reviewed the evidence, the tension reached a crescendo. My attorney presented the final argument, not with aggression, but with clarity and precision. Ownership was clear. The HOA had overstepped, and the law demanded recognition of rightful property. No amount of construction, no number of permits, and no assumption of momentum could override documented ownership. The logic was inescapable. And then, the moment of truth arrived. The judge leaned forward, eyes scanning the courtroom, and delivered a verdict that reverberated like thunder through every gallery, every desk, every chair. The land belonged to me. The HOA had acted without legal authority. The 9 to 6 homes, while impressive in scale, had been constructed on property that was rightfully mine. The deed, the surveys, the evidence, all had aligned to confirm what I had always known. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of disbelief, shock, and muted exclamations. The HOA's reaction was a study in silent horror. Board members froze, their confidence shattered, their authority nullified. Lawyers shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the case they had presumed would be routine had transformed into a complete defeat. Every construction they had overseen, every infrastructure improvement, every promotion and brochure now carried the weight of illegitimacy. They had been outmaneuvered not by force, not by aggression, but by meticulous preparation, patience, and the quiet certainty of rightful ownership. Following the ruling, the legal implications began to cascade. The court ordered that the HOA cease all claims to the property and acknowledge my sole ownership. Any further use, development, or occupancy would require my explicit consent. The impact was immediate and dramatic. The 9 to 6 homes, the streets, the parks, all stood as monuments of overreach, but legally, they were now on my land. The HOA's authority evaporated in an instant. I walked through the streets of the development afterward, observing the homes that had caused so much tension and planning. For months, these structures had represented intrusion, audacity, and the power of assumption. Now, they stood as silent proof of the consequences of arrogance and negligence. Every detail, from the roofs to the streetlights, was a reminder that meticulous preparation, legal knowledge, and patience could overcome even the most aggressive overreach. The HOA, meanwhile, faced the aftermath of their loss. Their reputation within the community was tarnished, their credibility in ruins, and their legal position fundamentally weakened. Prospective homeowners who had once been drawn to the neighborhood reconsidered their options, uncertain about the implications of a community built without proper authority. The narrative of overreach and defeat spread quickly, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of assuming control without verification. As I stood on my property, looking over the rooftops that had once represented violation and now represented vindication, a sense of quiet triumph settled over me. The battle had been long, meticulous, and strategic, but it had succeeded. 9 to 6 homes, countless hours of construction, and the arrogance of bureaucracy had been undone not through confrontation, but through preparation, evidence, and the unyielding assertion of rightful ownership. The final blow had been struck. The HOA had learned, in the most public and undeniable way possible, that assumptions cannot replace legality, that arrogance carries consequences, and that land, once claimed, cannot be taken without consequence. And as the sun set over the neighborhood, casting long shadows across the streets and homes, the stage was set for the final chapter, the aftermath, the rebuilding, and the ultimate reclamation of my sanctuary. The courthouse steps had barely emptied before word of the verdict began to ripple through the neighborhood. News outlets, social media, and word of mouth converged into a wave of astonishment. 9 to 6 homes, meticulously constructed over months on my property, now carried a new significance. They were no longer symbols of intrusion, but monuments to the consequences of arrogance and overreach. The HOA, once confident and domineering, had been exposed and legally stripped of authority. The shift in power was sudden, undeniable, and irrevocable. I returned to my property in the quiet of the early morning, walking down streets that only weeks earlier had been the domain of intrusion. The asphalt beneath my feet, the sidewalks, the streetlights, all built on my land, all once symbols of violation, now seemed strangely neutral. They were structures, immovable and visible, yet powerless without my consent. For the first time, I felt the full magnitude of the victory. The land that had been my family's sanctuary was officially mine once more, recognized by law and by fact. The HOA's reaction in the days following the ruling was predictable in its desperation and disbelief. Board members issued statements that attempted to justify their actions, claiming good intentions and misunderstandings. But the legal record told a different story. Their internal communications, their ignored doubts, and their reckless construction practices had been exposed for all to see. The narrative had shifted entirely. They were no longer arbiters of a community. They were a cautionary tale, a powerful example of what happens when arrogance meets accountability. Residents who had purchased or leased homes in the development were suddenly in a state of uncertainty. Some reached out cautiously, asking about legal implications and potential impacts on ownership or occupancy. Others, already aware of the HOA's defeat, expressed relief and curiosity. The property had changed hands legally in name only, yet the human dimension of the dispute, the fear, confusion, and shock added a layer of complexity that would ripple through the neighborhood for months. I spent those early days walking through my land, observing each home, each street, each corner that had been a battleground. The perspective was surreal. What had once seemed like a hostile takeover was now evidence of both my patience and the folly of overconfidence. Every brick, every fence, every street lamp told a story of assumption, ambition, and, ultimately, accountability. What was once chaos was now testimony. Reclamation wasn't just legal, it was psychological. For months, the HOA had dominated the narrative, projecting confidence and authority over my land. Their promotion materials, their public statements, their meetings, all had been designed to normalize the occupation. But the court ruling had flipped the story. Now, every conversation, every glance from neighbors, every press article reinforced the truth. The land belonged to me. Their confidence evaporated, replaced by public scrutiny and the quiet hum of justice realized. The process of reclaiming control over the property was methodical. Legal notifications were sent to ensure the HOA could not interfere, and steps were taken to protect my rights against any attempts at encroachment or misrepresentation. The once intimidating 9 to 6 homes were now fully under my purview, and I began planning the future of the land, not as a battleground, but as a sanctuary restored. Each house, street, and fixture became part of a carefully considered strategy for property management, community engagement, and long-term security. There was a strange satisfaction in observing the HOA's attempts to salvage credibility. Their online presence, their outreach, even their internal communications reflected a newfound caution. They were no longer aggressive, no longer certain. The public exposure and legal defeat had shifted their approach entirely. They had learned, painfully, that assumptions and momentum could not replace preparation, patience, and legality. And I, quietly vigilant, witnessed the lessons they had paid for firsthand. Walking through the streets, I noticed the subtle changes in the neighborhood. Residents, curious but cautious, began to inquire about property rights, legal safeguards, and ownership. Conversations in local cafes, online forums, and community spaces revolved around the case, the court ruling, and the implications for future developments. My victory became a case study in civic awareness and legal strategy, a reminder that even the most powerful organizations are accountable to the law. Where the legal battle concluded, the focus shifted to preservation and control. I implemented measures to protect the property from further overreach, ensuring that boundaries were clearly marked, access was controlled, and future development aligned strictly with my intent. The process was meticulous, a reflection of the patience and precision that had carried me through the previous chapters. Every step reinforced the principle that ownership is more than a title. It is responsibility, foresight, and vigilance. As weeks turned into months, life returned to a new rhythm on the property. The homes remained, the streets remained, and the infrastructure remained. But now, the land was restored in its purpose, a sanctuary under rightful ownership. The HOA, once a looming shadow of bureaucracy, faded into the background. Their authority nullified and their reputation diminished. The 9 to 6 homes, initially symbols of intrusion, became reminders of overreach and the consequences of assumption. The story of the land spread beyond the immediate neighborhood. Local news outlets, social media platforms, and community forums amplified the drama, turning the case into a cautionary tale for homeowners, developers, and HOAs alike. It was a narrative of patience, strategy, and the quiet power of rightful ownership, a story that resonated with anyone who had ever faced overreach, injustice, or bureaucracy. Standing atop a hill overlooking my reclaimed land, I reflected on the journey. The battle had been long, the stakes high, and the opposition formidable. Yet, through patience, strategy, and unwavering attention to detail, the land had been restored. What had begun as a violation, a source of frustration and anxiety, had become a testament to perseverance, preparation, and the law's capacity to uphold justice. The 96 homes, streets, and parks, once the symbols of intrusion, now stood as monuments to the lessons learned. Arrogance has limits, assumptions are dangerous, and rightful ownership cannot be denied without consequence. The HOA had been defeated not by force or confrontation, but by preparation, strategy, and a relentless pursuit of truth. As the sun set over the property, casting long shadows across the rooftops and streets, I felt a profound sense of closure. The battle was over, the land restored, and the stage set for a future defined not by conflict, but by vigilance, stewardship, and the quiet satisfaction of a hard-won victory. The land was mine again, not just legally, but in every sense that mattered.